Very good morning to you. We start with more changes to COVID travel rules, this time from 4 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Anyone entering the UK will have to show proof of a negative PCR or lateral flow test taken before travel, as well as having to self-isolate when you get back until you receive a negative PCR test within 2 days of your arrival. And anyone now arriving from Nigeria from tomorrow morning will have to spend 10 days in a quarantine hotel after the African country was added to the red travel list.
Well, let's get more on this now and some of today's other top stories with the help of the political commentator Jason Reed. A very good morning to you. Thanks for waking up bright and early this morning to join us on the Great British Breakfast. Look, lots of changes every day in this ever ongoing, never-ending COVID saga. Here we are with an extra country, the 10th African country being added to the red list, but perhaps more worryingly for the travel and aviation industry is these increased testing, which is hugely disruptive for travellers.
Exactly, yeah, this is part of the broader strategy to fight against the rise of the Omicron variant that we've seen over the past few days, following on quickly from new mask restrictions. But you're right that the travel industry is very unhappy about this. They're unhappy in particular about the fact that very little notice was given. This was announced yesterday, and it's going to come into force first thing on Tuesday morning. And so the travel industry believes that it was due to have a bit of a boom this month as people waited until the last minute to finalise their Christmas travel plans, but that this might just tip them over the edge of being a little bit too bureaucratic, a little bit too much of a deterrent when it comes to people booking those last-minute getaways for Christmas. And so the travel industry is going to suffer as a result of that, just as it was getting back on its feet after the pandemic. On the other hand, the argument from a health point of view is that you can't wait around to respond to new variants, as we've seen in the past. The worst thing you can do is to delay the measures that have to be implemented. The point about Omicron, of course, is that we know very little about it. We don't have the clinical data yet. We don't know whether it's vaccine resistant. There isn't any evidence to suggest that yet. But the government is keen to get out ahead of it and to slow down the spread. Although a cynic might argue that it's already here, it's already going to spread through the population anyway, so perhaps it won't make a huge amount of difference if we're just delaying it by a few weeks.
What's your opinion? Do you think that the government's got it right, or is it being too cautious, going too far too fast?
Well, you can understand where the government's coming from. It doesn't want to repeat past mistakes, especially when it comes to the run-up to Christmas. Last year, when we were told again and again it was one last push to save Christmas, and then of course we had very harsh restrictions over Christmas anyway. On the other hand, my concern is that these new variants are just going to keep coming, and we know that, I'm not a scientist, but we know that as viruses mutate, it's likely that they become more transmissible but less deadly as more mutations come. And so if we can't end the pandemic now, if we can't end restrictions now, and we're still panicking every time there's a new variant like this, then it's unclear to me, when will it actually end? When do we actually go back to normal? Most of us in our lifetimes, we've never had to come out of the other end of a pandemic. We've never had to learn to live with a virus like this, but I think that's exactly what we have to do now. And my concern is that this is just going to be a rolling thing where we have the looming threat of lockdown that never goes away, and we dip in and out of these kinds of restrictions around travel and around mask wearing and that kind of thing. And there's a real danger that it just will never end. And that would be a really bad thing, both for the industry, various industries such as the travel industry, and for our basic freedoms.
Sure. And look, RGB News viewers will have their own opinions on whether or not this is a panic or, in fact, the act of a responsible government, as you say, just trying to slow the pace of it to buy some time whilst that research is done. But we heard from the Health Secretary when he was announcing these changes yesterday, also urging people to step up, come forward, get their booster jab, very much describing that as the first line of defence. It's a big ask. We're hearing that at the moment, the NHS England figures said that 90% of critical care beds in England are being taken up by the unvaccinated. There does seem to be a step change, a bit more pressure for people to try and get their vaccinations.
Yeah, the booster jab sort of stumbled at the first hurdle. It was very slow getting started, but the government has now really thrown its weight behind it and is very keen, as you say, to see as many people take up the booster jab as quickly as possible. My instinct with this is that although I think getting the booster jab is a great thing and everyone should do it, it does feel a little bit like the government is just throwing a huge amount at the wall to see what sticks. Because when it comes to the first two vaccine doses, we knew from the very start of the pandemic that we were waiting and hoping for a vaccine to come along, and that when it did, that would make a huge difference in terms of being able to lift restrictions, being able to go back to normal. Whereas with boosters, the problem is that very much along the same lines as mask wearing and travel restrictions and that kind of thing, it's unclear where it ends. If we need a booster to fight against these variants, then what about in a year, 2 years' time, when there's another round of variants and there's another round of panic and another round of restrictions? Do we then just have to have vaccines every year? And perhaps that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think there has to come a point where we draw a line and we say we have to move on from this now, because otherwise we're just going to continue living in fear forever. And I don't think that's sustainable.
Jason, let's talk about the heartbreaking case of 6-year-old Arthur Labinio Hughes. It's invoked a lot of emotions for a lot of people this week. His stepmother being given a life sentence and the father getting 21 years for manslaughter. And those sentences are to be reviewed, apparently. And Boris Johnson ordering a wide-ranging inquiry into the role of police, social services, schools and the probation watchdog in safeguarding. What do you make of that, given when these kind of cases have arisen in the past? I'm thinking of cases like Victoria Climbié and Baby P. We've had these inquiries and it doesn't seem to have changed anything.
Well, the government is making all the right noises, but exactly as you say, we just hope that there will be something different this time, that we will actually be able to learn some lessons this time round. The sentences are going to be reviewed, as you say, but I think the more interesting part, more interesting than the legal part of this, is the social and political review that Boris Johnson is set to announce details of today, which is going to look into why this wasn't prevented and why these kinds of tragic cases keep coming up. In particular, the fact that there were so many warnings given from other family members, from teachers, about the way that Arthur was being treated, and that just went unheard. Social workers even visited Arthur's house and concluded that everything was fine and there was nothing to investigate and no action needed to be taken. Of course, we all know the tragic consequences of that. I'm a little bit sceptical, as you are, that we will actually learn anything from this inquiry, that we will actually be able to take any action and see anything change in the future. But at the same time, perhaps we should go into it with an open mind and see what the inquiry actually comes out with, because we really do need to look much deeper into this kind of thing. I'm reminded not too long ago of the Sarah Everard case, where we talked about the need for change in the Metropolitan Police and in the police more broadly, and that never really came, and there wasn't really an inquiry and investigation. So perhaps we can learn lessons from that with this case of Arthur, and to have an investigation that actually does bear some fruit.
You know, I wonder if it's possible, Jason, in the case of Arthur, to do as the government is hoping and separate the issue of lockdown from his case, because yesterday local councils were being urged not to use lockdowns as an excuse for any potential failings. I know that schools are being questioned as part of this investigation. Is it possible to separate the two, given the enormous pressure that families were under during unprecedented times? Any problems in a family unit were really exposed and rooted out during lockdown. And we heard time and again, didn't we, that domestic abuse went through the roof during that period. And I would just wonder whether or not there are some questions for Boris Johnson's own policy when it comes to this particular case.
Well, certainly one of the main areas of focus of the investigation will have to be the effect that lockdown had on this case. And indeed, I believe the investigation, it's already been announced that the investigation will consider whether there are specific new guidelines around safeguarding that should be introduced in case there is any future lockdown, to guard against exactly this sort of thing happening. But I think you're absolutely right. It's going to be difficult to separate those issues, because the issue of lockdown inevitably is so polarized, it's so political, that you have to somehow remove the political aspects from looking at a case like this, which is not political at all, which is just tragic. And I don't know if you can do that. I think it'll be incredibly difficult for the government to do that and for the investigation to do that. Even if it does, it's hard to see how the discourse more broadly responding to the findings of that investigation will be able to remove the political from the tragic. But we'll just have to wait and see whether we're able to do that and do everything we can to make sure that this doesn't become politicized, I think, because that would be a real danger here.
Yeah, just finally, Jason, quick word on the Labour Party suspending Deputy Leader Angela Rayner as head of communications, reportedly for on suspicion of placed under investigation, I should say. This is Jack McKenna on suspicion of a personal data breach relating to another Labour staff member. Not good for the rift that appears to be growing between Sir Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner. And of course, the Labour Party. Angela Rayner, Sir Keir Starmer can't sack Angela Rayner because she's voted in by the members.
Exactly. Yeah, this is Jack McKenna, Angela Rayner's head of communications, who's responsible for speech writing, for liaising with the media, a very senior and important aide. He denies any wrongdoing in this case. And of course, the allegation against Keir Starmer is that this is a political move, that he is trying to undermine Angela Rayner and start to question her authority publicly and begin to push her out. But exactly as you say, the problem with the Labour deputy leadership position is that it's directly elected. And exactly as we saw with Jeremy Corbyn and his deputy, Tom Watson, it's inevitable that you're going to get a leader and a deputy from different wings of the party. And so these rifts grow, and it means that the internal conflicts within the Labour Party just get magnified because both wings of the party have a very clear leader in either the leader of the party or the deputy leader, a kind of figurehead they can rally around. And it means that the leadership of the party is constantly under question. It means that there isn't a clear direction because the Labour Party continues to look inwards rather than looking outwards. It continues to occupy itself with these internal disputes. And so that means, as we've seen this criticism leveled at Keir Starmer again and again, that means that they're not seen as in touch with the country. They're not seen as in touch with the issues and what people care about because they're too busy fighting among themselves, and the situation with Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner doesn't look like it's going to improve in that sense anytime soon.
Interesting. Jason, thank you for joining us at 6:13 on a Sunday morning. Really appreciate it. Jason Reid there from Young Voices UK.